I'm Loretta Yarlow, Director of the University Museum of Contemporary Art, which is at UMass Amherst in the Fine Arts Center. And we have an exhibition on at the moment, one of our most major projects ever, Du Bois in Our Time. It's an exhibition that commissions 10 leading artists to reflect on the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's on through December 8th. If you haven't had a chance to come, please do come to the exhibition. It includes, again, 10 artists who have worked. Projects include film, video, photography, painting, sculpture, drawings, prints. It's an exciting, exciting show. We're open free to the public. During the week, open till 4:30, and on weekends, 2 to 5 p.m., Saturday and Sunday. And so I really want to thank PAHMUSA, the Pan-African History Museum, USA, for collaborating with us, and the dynamic director, Luana Hood, who I'm just beginning to get to know, and the incredible work that she's done in this community. So it's a great point of collaboration to have our museum up in Amherst to work with the Springfield community on this project. And I also want to thank the sponsors that have brought everybody together, our speakers. It's made possible by Mass Humanities and the Five College Lecture Fund. And I also just want to remind everyone that if you come November 20th to the museum, we have our final panel discussion next Wednesday at 5 o'clock in the Fine Arts Center, Voices of Protest, a conversation about Du Bois and the social movements of his time with three professors, Barbara Krauthammer from the History Department at UMass, Nick Brommel, American Studies at UMass, and Preston Smith, Professor of Politics and the Chair of Africana Studies, Mount Holyoke College. That'll be the final panel discussion that we'll have next Wednesday, 5 o'clock in the Fine Arts Center. So today, it's a great pleasure to have three speakers here today. We have Professor James Smethurst, Horace Ballard, and Kelly Morgan, whose conversation is titled, Open Your Eyes, about African American art from the Harlem Renaissance period through the Black Arts Movement right to the present day. James Smethurst is Professor of Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst. His scholarly interests include African American literature and culture, 20th century poetry in English, 19th and 20th century American literature, ethnic studies, literary modernism, film, music and popular culture, literature of industrialization and urbanization, cultural history, intellectual history, and gender studies. Professor Smithurst is currently working on a history of the Black Arts Movement in the South, and he's the author of a number of books such as The Black Arts Movement, Literary Nationalism in the 1960s and 1970s, which was published in 2005, and The African American Roots of Modernism, Reconstruction to the Harlem Renaissance, a publication just recently in 2011. Horace Ballard, Jr. has been the W.E.B. Du Bois Literary Fellow at UMass Amherst this past year, is the educator for school and teacher programs at the Museum of Art, which is connected to RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design. He holds degrees in American literature, religion, visual culture, and public humanities from the University of Virginia, Oxford, Yale, and Brown, respectively. He's worked at Monticello and the Southern Center for Contemporary Art, the Studio Museum, Harlem, and the Yale University Art Gallery. He's currently in his fourth year of doctoral study at Brown, working on a dissertation entitled The Beauty of Belonging, Rethinking American Citizenship and the Arts from 1785 to 1900. A forthcoming contribution to an edited volume on contemporary public art and religion in New York City will be published by Yale University Press next year. Kelly Morgan, originally from Detroit, Michigan, earned her BA in Africana Studies at Wayne State University in 2006 with her interest in African American conceptualizations of self-image. Kelly is in her fourth year of study as a doctoral student at the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of African American Studies at UMass Amherst. And also a second year student in public history at UMass. And her field of interest has been analyzing visual imagery, as she examines the ways in which people construct visual discourses, conceptualize images, and sometimes resist these discourses. Her interdisciplinary research concentrates on African American visual culture, linking art, history, performance studies, women's studies, and museum studies to analyze the complex ways that Black women artists visualize, represent, and reappropriate images of minority women to challenge mainstream visual discourse. This past year, Kelly has also been a graduate assistant working at the museum on our Du Bois exhibition, so it was a great way to collaborate. And in a sense, I feel as though we've really collaborated in many ways with all three of the scholars here. So thank you, all three of you, for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Loretta.
Thank you all for coming. I'd like to start off to say what a pleasure it is to be here at PAHMUSA. And I want to thank a bunch of people, Ms. Hood, Eva Fairst, Loretta Yarlow, and the other people who helped make this event possible and invited me to be a part of it today. So what we're going to be talking about today, and what I'm specifically going to be talking about, is African American visual art, and in my case at least, W.E.B. Du Bois. What I'm particularly interested in talking to you about here today, and by the way, I apologize for not standing up, but I can't run this technology because the thing is so low and stand at the same time. But what I'm going to talk about Du Bois and visual arts, and what I'm particularly interested in here today is how Du Bois's thinking anticipated and informed the development of African American art in the 20th century. I'm only going to go up to about 1975 or so, since my co-panelists will take up more contemporary visual art. Okay, so one of the obvious things about visual art is that it is the kind of art that we primarily get through our eyes, through looking at it. But there's also a strange way in which it looks at us too, or that we can think of visual art as actually as a kind of eye through which we see ourselves, or don't see ourselves if we're invisible in that art. More about this in a second. So, as Du Bois noted more than a century ago, that he talks about this, it's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on and amused contempt and pity. And what he means by that, I take it, this is from the Souls of Black Folk, 110 years ago. What he means by that, it's not that black people can't see themselves or can't see other people, but the way that we understand who we are in society, in a sense, the way that we understand our position in society, often comes through looking at or through what I'm calling here social vision. In other words, through newspapers, through art, through music, through the laws, all the different kinds of things where we see ourselves in there, and we sort of place ourselves in society, and it helps understand ourselves. And Du Bois is making the obvious observation back then, but nonetheless a profound one, that black people, by and large, they don't control the newspapers of the United States. They don't control or write the textbooks that you read about history in. They don't control the schools. They don't control most of the main newspapers. They don't control the mass media and the popular culture, not for the most part. So that basically you're looking, in a sense, if you look to find yourself in those places, you're looking to find yourself in a place that was created by other people. That is to say, white people. And that what one finds when one looks at this vision is a measure of yourself that is both one of amusement, one of contempt, or one of pity, or all of the above. And I have to apologize, some of these images will be insulting, but you have to understand what Du Bois is talking about. You're talking about this, unfortunately the darkness, this doesn't reproduce too well in blackface minstrelsy. Black people as tramps or as clowns. Black people as kind of dandified buffoons. Black people as being subservient, servants or slaves whose their highest goal in life was to make the flakiest biscuits or the most delicious pancakes for the white people for whom they worked, who were nostalgic about the old days of slavery. Or who were dangerous, I mean, both funny but also scary, dangerous, violent, sexually rapacious people. In short, what we're talking about is we're talking about a vision of black people in which black people are stupid, black people are lazy, black people are violent, black people are ugly, black people are they're loyal, but they're loyal in the sense that a dog is loyal, not in the sense that a human being is loyal to another person, that they are that they have they don't have any real intellect. They're instinctual, like animals are instinctual. In short, it's a pretty insulting vision of black people, or very insulting position of black people, which in effect justifies a second-class citizenship, the sort of thing that Horace Ballard talks about. I mean, who's able to be a citizen? So one of the things that Du Bois sets up early on is he in The Souls of Black Folks is basically saying that what needs to be created is what we might think of as a black counter vision, a black social vision, another kind of vision in which black people through which black people can look, or into which black people can look, and they can see themselves in a way that's truer than the one that they face in everyday life, one which allows them to see themselves as being able to act, as being able to be intelligent, as being able or being rational, as being beautiful and being ugly, no doubt, as Langston Hughes said, the right to be both, if you will, to actually to do things, and having done things in the world. And so Du Bois, by the time of the Harlem Renaissance, has developed further, and this is a very famous quote, some of you may know this, where Du Bois says that all art is propaganda and ever must be. And this is a quote of Du Bois that has been much misunderstood, much distorted. Because what he's talking about here is not talking about making art into some kind of simplistic slogan or some sort of simplistic banner. Not that there's anything wrong with slogans or banners. But what he is actually talking, and this is from the same article, is that once in a while, through all of us, there flashes, and he's talking about black people here, some clairvoyance, some clear idea of what America really is. We who are dark can see America in a way that white Americans cannot, and seeing our country thus, are we satisfied with its present goals and ideas? So he's saying that one of the things, and there are two things about developing this black counter vision, if you will, or alternate vision, or however you want to say, is that one, it allows black people to see themselves and find themselves as humans, as people, to understand who they are, where they've been, and where they're going, to get a real, genuine self-consciousness. The other thing he says, which is interesting, is he says that white people, if they have the eyes to look, if they have the intelligence to understand, if they are willing, they can also look through this vision. They could learn a lot. So this has I think these sorts of ideas has an intense effect on black artists. So we have the artist Gwendolyn Bennett, visual artist, did a lot of what we might think of as graphic art design, as well as what's sometimes called fine art. This is a cover from the Opportunity, the Urban League's journal in 1926. With the, this is a notion of black beauty, and it's a notion of black beauty you'll see here that connects the black woman, the new black woman of the 1920s, with black people of Africa. And the notion now, whether or not, it depends, whether or not one finds this totally beautiful is subjective, but the idea of a kind of notion of black beauty. We also, following Du Bois, and this is a little later, Aaron Douglas is one of the places Du Bois says in The Souls of Black Folk, and he'll go on to develop this, where you can begin to look for this black counter vision, this new way, another way of black people seeing themselves that is not the kind of school textbook or the tabloid headline or the minstrel show or the other distortions of black people is in black music, in the spiritual, something created by the folk in which one can begin to see oneself. In other words, and so then it becomes sort of suggesting in terms of the visual metaphor that this becomes a resource as well as a model for how black visual artists might look. And you can see that this aspects of Negro life from slavery through Reconstruction is one in which there is this notion putting forward of music, a kind of visual of black music that shows black people in another way as creating, as leading, as again acting. And Du Bois will further develop this. This is one of from his great history of Reconstruction, Black Reconstruction in 1935. And this is a long quote. I don't know if I have to read it all, but yet we are blind, talking about Reconstruction and how it had been represented as this terrible, terrible period in American history by white historians. This was something that was dominant in the schools really right down until I was a school child. And I wasn't a school child in 1935. We discern in it no part of our labor movement, that is the black labor movement, no part of our industrial triumph, no part of our religious experience. Before the dumb eyes of 10 generations of 10 million children, it is made a mockery of, spit upon, a degradation of the eternal mother, and so on and so forth. In other words, what he's talking about is he's talking about a vision of a kind of history, a kind of historical vision in which black people are not just acted upon, but that they are actors. It's not that Lincoln freed the slaves, it's the idea that the slaves freed the slaves significantly. They had help, they had allies, but that it was the idea that it was black folks that freed black folks, acting together. And that he inspires, this is part of what inspires a whole new kind of movement of black art in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s that would emphasize the actions of everyday people, common people, and the common people not simply as followers, but as leaders, as creators. This is from Hale Woodruff's Amistad mural that's at Talladega College in Talladega, Alabama. It's a mural of the rebellion of enslaved Africans against their, on a slave ship. These again are not, their leader, Sinbad, was a farmer, as far as we can tell. Most of these guys, men and women, were farmers. They weren't generals, they weren't noble people. They were, for the most part, everyday people rising up. This is you can't see this too well. This is a picture of them. They were eventually captured, and there was a trial about whether that they would be returned to slavery or whether they be free, that they were illegally captured. The slave trade at this point in history, this is in the 19th century, had been outlawed. And we see in the front, even though they have white lawyers and so forth, the person who's in the lead in the front, that black man in the white shirt who you can, it's not so easy to make out, is a guy named Sinbad, and he's the leader of the rebellion on the Amistad, and you see him being, not following white people. He sees them being in the lead of white people. This is another example of such a thing, of a similar sort of thing, of Elizabeth Catlett's series of black women who helped black people or worked for black people's liberation, freedom. This is of Sojourner Truth. This was from 1947. Now, one of the things that's important about Du Bois, and that this is something as we get down sort of to the end of my part of this, and this is, and we can keep going with Du Bois and his writing. The doctor lived for a very long time. He was active intellectual, political activist, leader, scholar, and so on, writer, editor for 75 years. Guy lived to be 93 years old, and almost all of that, right to the day he died, he was working. So we could go quite a bit farther. But I think that this is also a part of what he's talking about here in terms of social vision. Because what he's saying here is that the vision, the eyes, if you will, the social eyes that he wants to be created, is he's talking about, in terms of art, is he's talking about an art that's by, for, and of black people. It's not for white people, it's not to amuse white people, it's not to entertain white people, it's not to convince white people of their basic prejudices, but it's to demand truth. It's to demand that people work again for the black community, to show the black community as it is, and also the United States as it is. He, at the end, talks about Carter Woodson's Negro History Week, which is now has morphed into African American History Month. And he's, you can see here that Du Bois could be quite critical of black artists, but he's also setting a very high bar for black artists here, saying what they should do. Now, he's not saying that white people wouldn't benefit from looking at this stuff. A white person could learn, and other people too, but particularly white people could learn a lot from looking at an art that was by, for, and of black people. You would learn a lot about the United States if it wasn't just for your entertainment, because that wouldn't necessarily teach you much of anything. And so then we get this whole range. This is John Biggers in 1953, one of his Houston murals about the contribution of Negro women to American life in education. You have Jeff Donaldson's 1964 Aunt Jemima and the Pillsbury Doughboy, where he takes, after Du Bois is taking the social vision of, that is the white social vision of black folks, the Aunt Jemima of that you again see looking at you, the pancake mixes and so forth, looking at you from the supermarket shelf, and saying beneath that mask, beneath the way you're reading her, is another kind of person, is a real person who is a fighter, who is a thinker, who is a doer. We see this with Betty Saar's later liberation of Aunt Jemima, where we see Aunt Jemima and the sort of stereotype vision of her. If you maybe can't see it real well, but has a broom in one hand and a gun in the other. We see the Obasi Artists Workshop, Wall of Respect, which really starts the black mural movement of the 1960s, which is again a vision of a whole range of black life, really black heroes, people in music, popular music, jazz music, athletes, political leaders, religious, spiritual leaders, literary leaders, black women. This is Nelson Stevens' work to unify African people. This was a mural that was on the streets of Boston in front of the Roxbury black construction workers labor temple. Nelson, as I'm sure a number of you here in the audience know, my former colleague in Afro-American Studies at UMass, worked with various people at UMass and Springfield, people like John Kendrick, to paint over 30 murals in the black and Puerto Rican communities of this city. There was a time here in the city of Springfield where there were probably more murals per square foot per capita here than any place in the United States. This was once, maybe you could say, one of the black art capitals of the United States. And again, this is the notion of art by and for black people. So I think without further ado, I'll just end by giving the doctor credit, because he's the one who I think helped create this idea of a black social vision that I think black artists throughout the 20th century in one way or another riffed off of. Thank you.
Okay, well my presentation basically picks up where Dr. Smethurst leaves off and talking about Du Bois in particular and how him stressing this idea of this social vision and why we needed, or why African Americans needed a different type of vision and a different type of visual narrative, is because the negative images that were so prevalent in terms of African Americans was really the sort of foundation of Euro-American modern art. So these images were everywhere, they were in vogue, they were the things to be, they were the things to look at. Picasso's image that you see right there was actually celebrated as one of the most famous and the most important modernist works of the 20th century. So what Du Bois is really saying is that as African Americans who are creating at the time, we need to participate in these conversations. So we need to contribute our own images to either usurp or resist, challenge these images, do something different, than what is going out there. So as Dr. Smethurst showed you the quote from his criteria for Negro art and the idea of art being propaganda, he furthered that in 1926 in the February issue of Crisis with an ongoing symposium titled The Negro in Art, How Shall He Be Portrayed? Here, Du Bois poses the question, what are Negroes to do when they are continually painted at their worst and judged by the public as they are painted? In response, Du Bois printed the commentaries of the who's who of Harlem's intelligentsia. So there was responses from Carl Van Vechten, Jesse Fawcett, Charles Chestnut, Countee Cullen, and the like. But as art historian Lisa Gale Collins points out, that he didn't print any commentaries from any of the visual artists who were creating at that time. All the commentaries that he printed were from printers, writers, or editors. So what does this mean, right? If you're so very concerned with the visual, but you're not conversing with the actual people who are producing visual images. This presents a really profound, conundrum that has long affected, I think, African American studies in its arduous concern with visual representations. So, for me today, I ask rhetorically, how and why does this happen? And there are several answers that we can give for this today, but I want to focus on how artists in the 1980s and the 1990s still pick up on some of the ideas that Du Bois is championing at this time, and they find different, more subversive ways to address and critique negative representations in Euro-American art and also African-American expectations of what Black should look like in visual art. So I begin with Robert Colescott in 1985. He starts his career on the West Coast in the Bay Area, and he basically turns the art world on his head from 1970 to about 1984 with what he calls subversive appropriations. So basically what he does is he remakes these 19th and 20th century modernist masterworks. His satirical representations of these famous works offer salient critiques of race and class in America and questions the whole idea of originality and true representation. So again, those were the ideas that founded or defined modern art. Modern artists, European and American modern artists, were known as these true originators, when really majority of, or what influenced their style the most, was African sculpture. So this wasn't anything that they were just that was coming to them, serendipitously. They were studying African sculpture and reappropriating those images in their own work. So what Colescott does, he says that I think the way I have appropriated paintings is subversive because my version puts into question the ownership of the idea. The fact that the original work can be redone questions its value. I think that if I make a painting that has such a strong quality of irony or sass, I put a barrier between the viewer and the original work. So Colescott here, which it doesn't really show up very well for you either, but he sort of brings out the major problem with Picasso's Les Demoiselles. Picasso marries the idea of white prostitution and African culture, which was something that was very popular in European culture at the time, this idea that Black female sexuality was aberrant. And so to be a prostitute, to be a white prostitute was to relate you to Black female sexuality. Colescott paints his Black figures where they're obviously African American, or they're obviously black bodies. And so he brings that to the forefront in this image, something that Picasso sort of lays implicitly in his work. So artists in the 20th century continue to sort of reappropriate these European masterworks. In '89, Alison Saar, who was the daughter of the assemblage artist Betty Saar, that Dr. Smethurst showed, the artist who created the liberation of Ajamama, Alison Saar is her daughter. This particular piece is called The Dying Slave, which she remakes Michelangelo's masterpiece from 1515. Here, Saar uses African and African American folklore, historical experience, and artistic traditions to cloak the idealized human form that you see in Michelangelo's sculpture. So Michelangelo's Italian Renaissance masterpiece is based on classical Greco-Roman sculpture and symbolized ideal beauty. Saar has intentionally transformed that serene idea into a tense severity that represents transatlantic slavery. Her dying slave is undoubtedly an anguished black male who, unlike Michelangelo's slave, is suffering in death. The figure is composed of rusted ceiling tin, which represents skin tone, of course, and it also represents skin ruptures and the scarring that comes obviously with life on a plantation. And anchoring the torso of the sculpture is a mirrored cavity that mimics Congo power figures. And these power figures are wood statuary figures in which the abdominal cavity contains magical or medicinal packets called inkizi, which make the figure powerful, and it protects the owner of the figure. But she's also, in placing that object there, she's also illustrating slaves' vulnerability. The ways in which slavery affects the human spirit, right? So you get an area that's soft and unprotected. And you can't really tell here either. The lack of detail in the facial features, right? Also suggests that the figure is representative of the African diaspora. So this particular slave represents slavery throughout the New World instead of just one particular group of enslaved Africans. I skip ahead to the late 20th century and our good friend Kara Walker. Which everybody says she's the artist that everybody loves to hate. She was the youngest, one of the most controversial concept artists of the late 20th century. At the age of 28, she received a MacArthur Fellowship, which was very soon after she had just received her MFA from RISD. Her work stirred continuous controversy, both in the art world and in the African American community. I can attest to that with a personal story, as when her work was first acquired by the Detroit Institute of Arts, our Council of Baptist preachers and the African American community as a whole boycotted the DIA actually displaying the work. So the DIA spent $35,000 on this work, and it's been sitting in the museum basement for the last 15 years, 17 years, something like that. Yeah, and no one has seen it because people were just that outraged about displaying the type of work that she does. Her stunning and aesthetically seductive, as art critics describe it, black silhouettes, they reveal the underbelly of the plantation South. They question our cultural memory, particularly that idea of Southern, moonlight and magnolia situations in the South. She brings to light the ideas of seduction and fetishism and death and interracial violence, sexual depravity, things that were pretty much every day, on plantations. She brings those things to the visual in a way that makes censorship almost impossible. She challenges the high art world's idea of sensibility and decor. So what do we find pretty? What do we find aesthetically pleasing or visually pleasing? Which kind of backfired on her because the art world loves this work, right? And so then it's what does that say about the way in which we consume violence, rape, naked bodies, bodies in pain, you know, those kind of things, particularly when you're like hanging these type of stuff on your walls. This is one famous piece that went up by itself called Cut. The next slide is sort of a panoramic of the large exhibit. It's called Slavery, Slavery. And again, you can kind of see some of the like very negative sort of sadistic things that are happening in Walker's plantation space. So during the 21st century, African American artists returned to realism and naturalism and depicting black men and women. They render African Americans with this photo-like realness. Artist Kennedy Wiley, I couldn't find the name, like the title of this piece, but I love his work because it's all like the way he elevates black men is just amazing. But he has this trend with his larger-than-life heroic portraits of contemporary black men that are depicted in scenes from Renaissance masterworks. So now this is like early 2000 or mid to late 2000s. Kennedy Wiley. We return to this idea of appropriation, but Wiley's appropriating Renaissance masterworks much differently than Cole Scott is appropriating, right? He's blurring the lines between contemporary and traditional poses, traditionary and contemporary subject matter, questioning the ideas of subjectivity regarding African American men. He elevates the contemporary black male to the status of king or knight, suggesting that these young black men are not the thugged out, drug-wheeling, troubling black presence that are waiting to rob or kill at any given moment. Instead, I think his images are asking us to consider that maybe one day men like this may just save all of us. Here's another one entitled Sleep for 2008. That's my favorite one. I didn't really have commentary about this one. I just like it, so I put it in. It's very biblical, though. I think it has a Christ-like feel to it. My second 21st century artist, speaking of sleep, is Mickalene Thomas, who is also one of the artists featured in the Du Bois in Our Time exhibition. So if you get a chance to get up to Amherst to see it, she has beautiful pieces on display right there for you to see up close. In Sleep, De Femme Noire in 2012, Thomas transforms Gustave Courbet's 1866 painting, Le Sommeil, which is also called Sleep, which is an interior scene of two nude Caucasian women sleeping together. The restaging of this piece in nature, she depicts the two African American women reclining on richly patterned textiles, which definitely has an African feel. The contrast between their black and yellow skin tones echoes that between the dark and the fair-haired subjects in Courbet's piece. And the fact that she deliberately uses French in the title of her piece as well also acknowledges the fact that there's this lineage of Western art history. But what is very important about Thomas, and the reason why she does this, is it's a particular critique on the absence of African American bodies or black bodies within Western art historical narratives. She did, if you get a chance to go online and actually like look at the symposium videos from the Du Bois in Our Time, she gave a great explanation as to why appropriating European masterworks in this way affected her personally. And she was saying, as an art history student at Yale, you know, she just couldn't understand why there was, no matter how many classes she took, you know, there were never any images of black women, there were never any images of black people at all. And even though she could appreciate, you know, the works in which she was studying, it's like, how can we study sort of centuries of art and there's just absolutely no black faces ever anywhere? And so this is her contribution to changing that in terms of Western art historical narratives. So this is another one of her works. She does this really cool thing where she takes photographs of her subjects first, and then she repaints the photographs, and then she appliques them with rhinestones, which is amazing. So that's what I said, if you get a chance to go see the pieces that are at the museum, please do that. As you think of a lot of things when you think about African American culture and rhinestones, and you would never think of the things that she comes up with, what she chooses to do with them. I chose to end my talk today with a conceptual piece. So returning back to the 90s, the 20th century. I'm ending with David Hammons and looking at how he chose to represent African Americans through concept and material. So in terms of of changing social vision, right? Hammons' idea, and many other conceptual African American artists, felt that you didn't have to paint these sort of perfect pictures of African Americans in order to value African American culture and African American bodies. I think he's asking through this piece, can one visually appreciate and adorn the waste material that African American culture creates? And I believe he would answer that question with a resounding yes. This piece is titled Untitled Flight Fantasy and Lady with Bones. It's a recreation from a previous installation that he first showed in 1975 in the Just Above Midtown Gallery. The materials are greasy brown paper bags, human hair, barbecue rib bones, wire and other found objects. And Alison Sarr does this too, where she uses a lot of found objects, the things that you would consider to be detritus or trash in her work, and sort of elevates it to these spaces. So according to Hammons, he feels like hair is the essential sign of blackness. Barbecue and hair, when aligned with African Americans, become cultural tokens. So he sees the work as having a particular meaning for African Americans. So even though it may be a bit inaccessible to white viewers, because it's not relevant to white culture, and because it kind of confirms those popular assumptions, the whole chicken assumption or stereotype about blacks. He still says that, these are very important things to see and to appreciate. So to quote him, he says, "Oh, dirty bags, grease bones, hair, it's about us. It's about me. It isn't negative. We should look at these images and see how positive they are, how strong, how powerful. Our hair is positive, it's powerful. Look at what it can do. There's nothing negative about our images. It all depends on who is seeing it, and we've been depending on someone else's sight. We need to look again and decide." Thank you.
So thankful that you're here, and thank you for joining us today. I want to thank my wonderful co-panelists, as well as Eva Fierst and Loretta Yarlow of the University Museum for Contemporary Art at UMass. And I thought that I would kind of start in 1785 and then take us to 2008 very quickly. And it's around this idea of post-black art. Many of you are probably familiar with this term post-black. There's a lot of discrepancy about who coined it, who found it, but it's post and it's black. So we kind of all found it and coined it at some point, right? This idea that in sociological or even political terms means someone of perhaps, let's say, a certain class who would define themselves broadly as an American of African descent, who through class means, through education, is really invested in the cultural histories and struggles of their race, but is not defined by it. And this is kind of the lineage we get coming out of the book, The End of Blackness by Deborah Dickinson in 1995, Touré's book, Who's Afraid of Post-Blackness, in the past few years. But in African American visual culture, post-black, I argue, has been around at least since the time of Du Bois's New Negro movement, if not in 1785. Yes. This image doesn't show up so good. This one is probably slightly better. I apologize, but I do want to return here. Guillaume Letellier in 1784 was up against Jacques-Louis David for the Prize de Rome. And the winning vote of the Prize de Rome in 1784 was cast by America's third plenipotentiary to France, Mr. Thomas Jefferson, at the Grand Salon at the Louvre. Thomas Jefferson chose Jacques-Louis David's Death of Camilla and Oath of the Horatii as the winning work, and not a work created by an African American from Louisiana. The one thing I do want to show, regardless of the fact of whether Jefferson knew of the race of the artist or not, is a bit immaterial. But it's a dark work. It's called La Mort de Camilla, or The Death of Camilla. And many of you might be familiar with the Oath of the Horatii, which is actually the painting I was named after. You have the father and the three Horatii men all giving their blessing to fight the Cariati brothers for the rule of Rome. Only one brother returns, and it's sad to see because Lethier has painted him as the stunning image of the Emperor Nero, who killed his mother and his brothers to take the throne. And in the story, so goes that his sister, who is married to one of the Cariati brothers, is a bit confused. Her husband and all of her brothers-in-laws have been killed, and so she has a momentary crisis in which she doesn't smile when she sees her brother, and thus he kills her. Right? It definitely in kind of the view of the Pietà, with this very white body clothed in red, white, and blue, being held up by women, and his sword is dirty, even though he's wearing the laurel nobilis. So I'm sorry that you can't see it, but it's an incredibly beautiful image, particularly thinking about skin tones. Now, the thing about Lethier is that he was born a slave to a mother who was a slave. His father was a planter, and his father then came under the influence of the Emperor of France. And at 17, after his son became famous in New Orleans for painting, is taken to France and becomes the court painter at Versailles. So this idea of now I am supported by the very institution that kept my mother a slave, right? Also of interest is that Lethier, like Alexander Dumas, could not pass for white. This is another famous one by Lethier, many years later, but honoring the Haitian Revolution. So I'm really interested, as Professor Smithauer has mentioned earlier, of this relationship in the 18th and 19th century between how do societies and groups define what is beautiful versus how do those self-same societies and groups define who is a citizen, who belongs. And my idea through poetry, through visual arts, is that ethics, aesthetics, politics are the same tripartite side of the same coin. So I'm thinking about this idea of post-blackness, and I just want to show you images, and we'll have time to talk about them later. But thinking 19th century, early 20th century, artists with complicated relationships to race, largely self-taught or educated outside the US, black artists who refuse to paint black subjects. And at the end, someone like Du Bois, who is a master at making himself what the Germans call a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total work of art, as one of the first artists, because Du Bois is a masterful artist, who controls his own images. So this is Robert S. Duncanson's A Dream of Italy, 1865. Duncanson, who was asked by his son, why do you not paint black subjects? And he said, I do not need to. Right. Edward Mitchell Bannister, one of the founding artists of the New England Art Club, and also one of the founding artists and the first painter whose works entered the RISD collection, followed by Lethier. Henry Ossawa Tanner, and Du Bois. On the left is Du Bois's Carte d'Exposante at the Universal Exposition, the World's Fair in Paris in 1900, taken by the most famous photographer in the world at that time, Paul Nadar. Du Bois looks good, doesn't it? Looks real good. And then to the right is an unknown photograph that I love and talk about a lot. Same year, same time, by an unknown artist. It could be Paul Nadar, but we're not quite sure, of Du Bois standing outside his window in 1900. Du Bois is a master at crafting his own images. And as many of you have heard me speak about at length, if you read his autobiographies and you read the sections that chart out the members of his family, and then if you have the privilege to go to UMass Amherst, you can see the photograph album and how he's looking at the members of his family who can pass for white, and those are the members who get inscribed in his autobiography. So then we jump. If we're thinking about this idea of post-Blackness, artists who are deeply ingrained in their own culture, but choose or do not need to be defined by it, and then even hesitate for their work to be called Black work, or Black art, or African American art. And sometimes even, as some of the ladies in this case, don't even like their work to be called American art. These are artists born post-Harlem Renaissance, post-Depression. They actively use stereotypes, a lot of collage, assemblage, cut-ups, and really invest in this ability to self-define, which is often defined, if they elect any labels, by gender or intellectual tradition rather than race or nationality. And here I'm thinking of an artist that we've seen, Betty Czar, her Ragtime, Howardina Pendell, Adrian Piper, and Kara Walker. Kara Walker is a really interesting artist, born in 1969, right on this cusp of thinking about conceptual art, thinking about women who would not necessarily be defined in the freestyle show at the Studio Museum of Harlem as a post-Black artist, but definitely works in those ways where perhaps her goal for how she wants her arts to read is not the way that her work is read, especially in the 80s and 90s by art critics. So then thinking post-Black artists as traditionally defined, born from 1970 to the present, included in the Freestyle exhibition, a 2001 exhibition at the Studio Museum in Harlem, in which Thelma Golden, the head curator and director, and the wonderful conceptual artist Glenn Ligon conceived this idea of post-Black art, which is essentially a generational shift, they said, of artists who know the struggles, know the history of Blackness in America, but are very reluctant, even hate the idea that their work would then be confined by those same struggles. One of the things that's not talked about in the artists that I might show is also that this is the first generation of African American artists that is by and large solely artists and derive their major living, which is a good living, from their art. Number two, all of them were trained in either very prestigious BFA or MFA programs, if not both. Right? So that sense that though they are working with a variety of media, a variety of ideas, a variety of compositional techniques, they are by and large trained in a very particular studio method. So this would be Rashid Johnson, Julie Mehaletu, Layla Ali. And I'm sad these don't show up. Layla Ali is amazing as a graphic or fine artist, and it's very interesting. Her work, her figures are all very dark green. Okay. Mark Bradford. And so now I want to show you a couple of images that don't quite fit, or maybe fit a little too well. So 3 years ago, I had the distinct honor in my last year of graduate study to be paired with 3 other students to help kind of curate Yale's collection of African American art. Yale has one of the largest collections, over 2,000 pieces. So we had to choose 40 from 2,000. And one of the big questions we had after we got through the 19th century, we got through the Harlem Renaissance, we got through this idea of artists post-Depression, is thinking about what to do with white artists who trade in the analogies and metaphors of Black bodies. And this goes back a long time, right? Hiram Powers, The Greek Slave. which is this wonderful idea that William Box Brown at the World's Fair in London says, the Greek slave stands white and 7 feet tall, but casts a 10-foot black shadow that no one at the Crystal Palace walked on. Jerome Liebling, Butterfly Boy, which was my favorite image as a child growing up. Robert Frank from the series The Americans. Isn't that amazing? A bread line of Black Americans. Where's the top?
He's not the person who took that picture.
He is. He is. Carl Van Vechten's series of famous people from the Harlem Renaissance, including this really striking one of Billie Holiday. And I'm sorry it's so dark, but the photographer Sally Mann, who came to prominence in the 80s, early 90s for nude images of her own children, and there was a huge controversy, has now decided to rethink her ideas around children, gender, sexuality, fetish, masculinity, and photographing young Black girls and older Black men in rural Virginia. And this image, which of the 200 works by white artists that were categorized in African American art at Yale, this is the only one that we decided to actually put in the show. It's by the artist David Bates. It's Katrina portrait number 1. He's still doing them. There are over 400 of them now. About 30 of them are now in major collections. This was an incredibly striking image, we thought, and one that I think is a really interesting one to define that idea of white gaze and spectrality on the Black body, but also thinking about the power. This work is about this size, and it radiates power, right? It radiates anger, it radiates poise, it radiates an intellectual ability to question the world. And it is one of those things. Is this Black art? Is this post-Black art? In that way that we always think about portraiture and kind of in allusion to and collusion with the patron, right? That things are commissioned and then there's a portrait. So what happens when you have a white artist who is working under those things and doing the best thing he's doing, but the power that he has is so substantial, right? Versus the power of the people that he paints. And yet, there is an inherent dignity. And so I think those ideas is where I would like to end, kind of thinking about this idea of post-Blackness, new Blackness. Who gets to talk about these images? Who says, oh, well, David Bates is Blacker than Julie Moretu, right? Or Julie Moretu perhaps may have less negritude than Rasheed Johnson, right? And thinking about Kara Walker's The Black and White versus Howardina Pendell, this incredible assemblage that people have likened to peace quilts and applique in her work, right? Versus this, where both images in Du Bois archive, Du Bois has written pages on them in French and German, right, but not English. Our Henry Ossawa Tanner, even our friend Robert S. Duncanson, whose name was always pronounced and spelled wrong up until last year, right? Our Edward Mitchell Bannister, who people swore was white, even though there are many pictures of him and he can't pass, and his wife was the first African-American landowner in Rhode Island. Or Guillaume Leterre, who was born in America and the Encyclopedia Française still has as born in Paris. Right? Thank you.
We mentioned that you mentioned something about an artist by the last name of Cantrin, who did some music
Kendrick,
in the area.
John Kendrick.
Can you say a little bit more about that?
Well, he was somebody, a UMass student actually. Isn't John Kendrick still active? In John? Oh, Hushabaz, active in this area down in Springfield? I believe he is. And that he is someone who worked very closely with my former colleague Nelson Stevens, who also lived in Springfield for quite a long time, although now he's living in Baltimore. And Nelson, whose history in black visual arts, painting, murals, he did all kinds of, or does all kinds of things. He, through UMass, had a group of students, many of whom were Springfield people, who came up to, who he got money so they could come up to or be credentialed through UMass, and they went around the mostly black and Puerto Rican communities of Springfield and did murals, of which I don't believe any, some were outdoors, some like at the Urban League building, which I assume was, the Winchester Square, Mason Square Library, but that some were indoors. I don't know that any of them still survive, but they did like 30 some odd murals right here in the city of Springfield. And
Is that Kendrick with King?
no, Kendrick, Kendrick. And they, if you think about a city the size of Springfield, what is it, about 150,000 people, per capita, if you just think of that crew alone doing like 35 murals, that's like more, probably per capita, is probably more murals than places like Chicago or Detroit or Philadelphia that we think of as being sort of black mural central in this period. I mean, this place, has a glorious history in that. It'd be nice, maybe if I get a minute to try to do it. But, I think that, folks here who are in Springfield, if they wanted to, should, some of these people have to still be, I know some of them are still around, talk to these people, and it would be a fabulous thing, that maybe through PAHMUSA or maybe through a lot of, or other institutions here in the city of Springfield, recapture this glorious moment, see if they can find, there aren't that many pictures, unfortunately, of these things that.
There's one still inside the Met building.
Right.
And I actually went to the.
And that's John Kendrick's. That's John Kendrick's.
And it's now a discount furniture store, and I let them know, never do anything to this mural, and they were like, they had no clue.
Oh, wow.
Ms. Hood, are there, because Nelson himself was uncertain of how many survived. Are there any more of these murals from that period that still survive here?
Where there used to be, where the moss is now, on the back of this, there's a mural there that's still there. Carl Yates.
Right, yes.
Would know more. But there's two right now. If you're coming up State Street, if you look toward the left, where the moss is, you'll actually see it. But where on the right, coming up State Street, at the discounted furniture place, you have to go inside and turn the corner because it's on the wall leading toward the basement.
Right. So this would be a wonderful project. What's something I've been thinking of doing with students at UMass is just a question of, or maybe with people here and up there is, one thing, if people did some research, the history, and then take a census of whatever's left, because the thing about these murals is mostly they don't last long. Things happen to them.
Well, actually what we did, I worked with a group, it was, I believe, Youth Bill, a couple of years ago. And we had the children get in front of the murals, take a picture, and then write a poem about it.
That's wonderful.
So that turned out very nice.
Do you have, was that published at all?
No, it wasn't published. It's something that, and it wasn't the Youth Bill, it was with the Smith Museum that we did it.
Oh, that would be, that'd be, could there be any way that we could get a hold of, like, the poems and the pictures?
Well, you know what, I have to look through my house because I do have it somewhere. I do have it
We
somewhere.
should do something with that.
It was
Yeah,
at
that
the,
sounds
it was at the
fabulous.
Smith College Museum?
I'm sorry.
The Smith College Museum?
No, it was George Walter Vincent Smith years ago that we did it with.
So that's, that's what I know, but there's obviously, a lot of the people are still down here. This is, I'm a few projects, ahead of doing something, before I do this, but this would be something that people down here they could do it.
The reason I asked is because I recently saw at one of the two Boys and Girls Clubs, the one in Plymouth Bank, the Family Center, two murals. And I didn't recognize the name. I know, and it sounds like Kendrick's.
Well, it could very well be.
And unfortunately, I found out that there was another one taking up in Taiwan, and someone within management a few years ago decided to take it over.
Well, this happens all the time, the things that are absolutely great. So for two things is, first of all, to have the records of it so we at least have pictures of them, but also when people become aware of them and you can agitate around them, then places, like Ms. Hood was saying, she goes up to him and says, "Don't you dare touch that mural," then people will think twice about touching that mural, because this happens. There's the Wall of Respect of Atlanta. It's a major mural that was there forever, and then last time I was in Atlanta, or a couple times ago when I was in Atlanta, it was off of Auburn Avenue, and I was like, where the hell is? Pardon me, but where the heck is the mural? And they said that just one day some building owner just painted it over, didn't tell anybody anything, and it's like this was just shortly, painted not too long after the Chicago one was one of many walls of respect, and it was a beautiful and historic piece of art. So that's the thing is, that's the problem with public art. You got to document it, you got to try to preserve it. It also, if it stays, like some of the murals they've done in Northampton, then you got to get local people involved and get some money to maintain them and restore them, because they, if they're out in the weather, that's one of the reasons they can get away from painting them over, because they look like hell after a while if you don't again, hell, but they look bad if you don't do it.
Just fascinates me how people let such these very intentional, very communal spaces go to waste, or not let them, but they don't know, they're not consulted. This is their piece and they're not consulted about it. But I'm from Detroit too. Kelly and I are friends. And one thing I noticed, there's a lot that's not there anymore, but people make sure they update that Malice Green mural. Mm-hmm. Even though there's nothing over there, the grass isn't cut. Malice Green was a man who was killed by the Detroit police in the early 90s. And around the spot where he passed, they painted a mural just of his visage, his face, and it's been there since roughly 92, 93. Yeah. And the storefront is empty. That area is pretty much house, lot, and the grass is not ever cut, but that mural is clean.
All the time.
All the time. It's scary. But it's
because it's nothing else in that area is.
But no one, it's amazing. It's a sad and ghostly reminder of what happened, but it's amazing that that mural just stands, and it's been up for at least the last 20 years.
I also had a question for Kevin. I was thinking about Kara Walken, and one thing that you touched on was the relationship of the artist to Western culture, but I was thinking about the relationship of Black artists to the Black community, and maybe some of the response she got to her artwork complicates, how we understand somebody as Black and sort of being connected to the community. You have any thoughts on that?
Well, no, I totally do. Because I think the same thing is kind of happening, not maybe in the same intensity, but with Kerry Washington and Scandal. Where there's this, we put this responsibility on African American women artists in particular, right, to portray, to have these really, you say something about this too, Horace, to have these, corrective, representations. And if they're not corrective representations, or representations that correct the Aunt Jemima image, or that don't sort of usurp those negative images, then it's a problem. Then it's just because you hear about that with Kerry Washington's character on Scandal. It's she's the Jezebel all over, or she's Sally Hemings, right? But then where does that allow for African American women to be able to visualize full life experiences, right? So our mistakes, and the ugly side of things, and it makes you that much more human. And then I think another thing that people misread Walker as well is like that particular series came out of a very traumatic personal experience she had when she moved from California to Georgia. And was not able to adapt. You know, she was she was called pickaninny by other black people, you know, because of her skin color and because of her hair texture, and it really shifted, you know, a lot of things for her. And so that was the artwork was the result. And you know, a lot of times, you know, as a community, we have these expectations, you know, of those of us who are visible, you know, to do certain things without kind of doing our own research, you know, and sort of unfairly. So not to say that, you know, that her work doesn't sort of signify, you know, on some really terrible, you know, visual images. But the ways in which we have to think, I think she's asking us to think outside of those things, right? And to like push ourselves deeper to kind of to see past like the obvious violence or the obvious like, you know, sexual abuse. To the society that sort of sets up a situation for something like that to be able to happen.
Kelly, I think Kara Walker was maybe consulting with, his name is Steve McQueen's film, 12 Years a Slave. And you know, Steve is British citizen now, living in Amsterdam, from the African diaspora, and so he felt compelled to make his first picture length. But I believe Kara and Steve were in some form of collaboration early on when he was doing his research. So it's a similar situation where it's. I haven't seen it yet.
I haven't seen it either. Have you seen it?
I have seen it. I have seen it. I was thinking, if I could just quickly piggyback, is thinking about someone like Kerry Washington, who's described in the press as dressing like a Grace Kelly or an Audrey Hepburn, but no one talks about how she sees herself, which is bringing back the fashions of Lena Horne and Dorothy Dandridge, right? And so this sense that black women, right, and so that young black women are looking to her, and yes, she's lovely and stunning, exceptional in so many ways, but even the story about the other exceptional, wonderful black women that she feels she's in conversation with, that she feels inspired her, are not talked about. It's like, why is Grace Kelly what we always go back to? And in thinking of Kara Walker is interesting, as you were saying, Kelly, quite beautifully, the roles that we expect our visible African American brothers and sisters to take is the sense of, for Kara Walker, married to a white man. Betty Starr, married to a white man, having these incredible interracial children who also are artists. And Kara Walker trying to work that out herself, as well as her daughter's experiences as well, in thinking about a post-black, multiracial, transracial world. And I'm thinking so much about the incredible artist who's in the Du Bois in Our Time exhibition, Brandon Fernandez, you know, born in Kenya of Jamaican and Indian and Canadian descent, right? And this sense of, where do I fit? You know, what happens when you're the toast of the art world at 28? And so already you've spent more time in Paris, London, Ghana, Accra than you have in California, where you were born. You know, what does that mean? What does that give you? And how much harder do you have to fight? And how much harder are you expected to fight?
Also, that's the idea of this weird social, talking about the social vision, and it says something about, you know, again, that it might almost seem ludicrous if you think about it for more than a second, that sometimes it's put on us. I mean, Grace Kelly, you know, I'm older than a lot of people in this audience. I don't think about Grace Kelly a whole lot. How often, if I said Grace Kelly to you, is that a name that, like, you all over there who look quite a bit younger than me, is that somebody who you think about a whole lot, and you're, you know, like, as a point of reference? I mean, isn't that kind of crazy that, you know, you have somebody who's basically like this white beauty icon of the 1950s, and comparing a contemporary black actress to somebody? It's sort of like comparing Obama to Stalin. Who thinks about Stalin? You know, it's weird. just in passing, it's an odd, but it does say something about you know, a need to put out something else.
That just, like you said, that American narrative, you know, like like who, I see you say. That American narrative, you know, and who would American, you know, because we talk about this in class all the time, right? Like, you know, to be American and to be citizen is to be white. So when you label something American, you have to have, it has to have a white face on it in particular situations.
And she's considered beautiful,
Yeah.
so there we must compare her to the American who became a European princess legitimately. You know,
But-
like we
but-
have to make that.
But if I can just say one thing, and then I guess other people want to ask questions, but I do think that this is a really important piece of this, is also this sense, which is part of our own contemporary moment, that old vision is broken down or is breaking down, which is one reason why we have such hysteria, if I do say so myself, in this country that's often, you know, I say so myself, by white people, especially white men who are like my age and older, of a time when they feel like that this vision, this way of looking at things, this way of seeing things is simply not holding up as well as it used to be, that it's in crisis, that's in question. So why then go back? You know, they're not talking about, you know, pick, you know, I don't know, Miley Cyrus. I don't know how beautiful Miley Cyrus is, but you get the idea. They're not picking as sort of somebody who's a young contemporary person. You know, not even Julia Roberts, who's older, but you know, is sort of still actually making movies, but is going back to a time where they can imagine an America where this vision was unchallenged. And so I think that even the fact that you picked Grace Kelly is I mean, it's bizarre, but it's also telling, you know, about like. Yeah, exactly.
Go ahead, Richay. What was your question?
So I have two questions. One is my daughter's question, and it's at Kelly. And she wanted to know more about what happened with Kara Walker in Detroit and her experiences with the protesters. And then my second question is for her, so I'll wait.
Okay. It's really quick. She never came, so the piece was acquired from like an auction. So she never came to the city to, you know, wasn't going to be like a big unveiling. But Valerie, that's the curator's name, who's over African American art at the DIA, hadn't gotten the job yet, and she was just consulted on the purchase, and so she had informed the curator who made the purchase, like, you need to go out, you need to talk to the churches, you need to say something to somebody about this. But for a very, very long time, the DIA was its own entity. You know, it existed in its own little bubble, even though it was in the middle of the city.
So tell Nyla, who's 13, what the DIA is.
Oh, sorry. It's the Detroit Institute of Arts. So it's our major art museum. And, you know, and they just figured they could do what they want to do, you know, because, the community doesn't really visit the museum very much. And they tried to put that piece up, and the community visited in a way that they didn't really want the community to visit. But no, it's still in storage right now, so it's never been shown. Yep, it's never been shown.
So my question first, I felt like at the end, and thank you all for your presentations, but I felt like at the end you gave us back a lot of questions about how do we make sense of all of these, you know, kind of post-Black, maybe post-Black, how do we understand these artists and their work, which I love because it made me kind of think about that. But I'm wondering how you're making sense of these artists' work, and then I guess kind of, you know, one of the things that I struggle with was as we think about post-Blackness, right, especially in the Black community, like for African descendant people, what does it mean for us as a community to say we don't need to really identify with our Blackness anymore? Like we're beyond that, right? We've outgrown it. So what does that do to our community? What does that do to our ability to mobilize politically, and things like that? So I'm wondering if, you know, maybe I put some stuff out there that you weren't even thinking about, but I am wondering really what you're thinking about in this how you're pulling these artists together?
Thank you for that. I think for me, for someone who made the conscious choice to be invested in the 18th and 19th century, I see these threads along the lines that you're talking about that I find fascinating and I find really disarming, but I don't even have the words to put my emotions around, which tells me there's a lot of work to be done, right? And that's where my academic work and intellectual work and work in the community arises. My first kind of response would be, even sensing that the word community is a right one to describe the diaspora or people of African descent in the Americas, I think is not an unstrategic, not an unintellectual, and not a non-activist approach. Because I think that in a lot of the conversations around post-Blackness lately, there's a lot of talk to this neoliberal individualism. And so I think that if one uses the word community now, post-civil rights, whatever post-civil rights means, we're still struggling for civil rights, right? But if we want to say post-Civil Rights Act of 1964, then I think we are making the conscious choice to say that post-Blackness cannot ever exist in the world that we live now for the masses. Post-Blackness, I think the images I've shown, has always existed for the individuals. And I think that one of the things in my work about Du Bois is to say how Blackness is always a tension that Du Bois lives with, I think, until like 1910. And then 1912 and 14, when he becomes the editor of Crisis and Horizon and Opportunity, and then continues it until the beginning of World War II, when he has to contend with his own relationship to a National Socialist Germany, and then resigns as the editorship. Because Du Bois, y'all, from 1914 to 1936, I would argue, is the major arbiter of African American aesthetics in this country. Every photograph and ad that goes in Opportunity, Horizon, and Crisis for a period of time has to come across his desk, and he says it's beautiful enough, it's representative enough. And for Du Bois to say that, you gotta be doing a lot of things, right? You have to do a lot of things. And so he stops it at this moment when we have in art the term to expressionism and abstract expressionism, right? So all of that to say, I don't know. I really don't know. But I think that if we take the long view on post-Blackness, and we recognize that using the word community and striving for even trying to articulate how the Black press and a community makes sense of it, I think that is an activist political position. And then to live into it, I think is the real work of how we go about building it. And I think that we see these individuals, we see the UMCA, we see the W.E.B. Du Bois Center for Africana Studies, we see these groups, we see the Studio Museum, we see different groups, we see churches, we see PTAs, we see community groups around the nation and the world trying to answer that question. And I think the thing is that we cannot assume that even the word community is a vestige and is a natural vestige. It is a fight. It is an everyday fight to live into that community and to understand that it doesn't matter your social status, it doesn't matter your educational status, as long as, I think this is where Du Bois comes to toward the end of his life, right? As long as any brown-skinned face is oppressed anywhere, we are oppressed everywhere, right? And to believe that or not to believe that is a really powerful assumption.
I just wanted to just say, if you don't mind me saying one thing, because it's something I was thinking of quite a bit about. I mean, I think it's recently, and it's, the saying post-Black is not the same thing as saying post-racial in the way that it's used sometimes, and that, whether or not you agree or how, in this discussion of these and what these artists are putting out there, is trying to come to grips with the time in which something has happened which I never expected, and many of us, the older people in this room, and maybe some of the younger people in the room, never expected to see in our lifetime, which is a black president existing on one hand, on the other hand, that a young teenager in Sanford, Florida could be gunned down, and that the jury could decide, could decide, or a judge could decide that he actually legitimately was a threat, or that a teenager in suburban Detroit black teenager could be shot, blasted with a shotgun through a screen door. Woman, blasted through a screen door. And the thing about it, as horrible as it is, the thing that I find in terms of the social vision thing that I keep harping on, that I find almost, well, I mean, obviously someone getting murdered is always disturbing. But, the sad fact of the United States is that people are shooting each other. Crazy people are shooting each other every day, everywhere, for every kind of weird reason one can possibly imagine. But what I find really disturbing, even more disturbing, is the fact that the police and the local authorities did not charge this man until a tremendous number of protests had taken place, which means that they seemed to accept the idea that it was plausible that this young woman, like 18, 19-year-old woman, through a door physically far smaller than the guy who shot her, could be legitimately construed as being a threat. Then we're going back to the images that I was showing there. So I think, thinking along what Horace is saying is in post-black is people trying to come to grips with, like, well, obviously things are different. A black president means something. Whatever you think about Obama's politics, a black president means something. But at the same time, you look at what happened in Dearborn Heights, you look at what happened in Sanford, Florida, you look what seems to be happening over and over again in the United States, and you're just saying, well, okay, but...
Yeah, and they were struggling with trying to term it something, I think, in terms of like how black became defined in that late 60s, early 70s moment. And so then being an artist or being a black person in Reagan in the Reagan era in the 90s, and how, these multi-dimensionalities of racism. And so what do we call this moment, and post-black ended up being sort of that tag term that everybody jumped on because people were asking, golden, like, well, what is that? So like, are we not black anymore? Like, how does that work? Yeah. So I think that's the other thing.
But she amended it to say maybe it just means post-black art.
Yeah, she did.
She did. And I think, if I could, it's also thinking about whether we term, I think there are some of us in the room and perhaps in the world, at least in my family, right? There are those of us who think Barack Obama is the first African-American president and those who think he's the first black president, and that those two terms are very different. Well, and I think that goes to something that I was thinking about now that I've had a bit of hindsight, is thinking about the womanist movement separating from second and third wave feminism at the same time as the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and how so many of these women, Emily Towns, Katie Cannon, elsewhere, Ntozake Shange, are now inscribed in the academy in huge ways, right? Like, these ladies are not leaving, and their institutions will fight to keep them. So also thinking about that term of, these incredible individuals who are like, feminism is not working for us and still does not understand privilege or is invested in my struggles. So now I need a new term, right? And I think that the sense that is happening, the generation of women who talk about art and literature and music and politics and spirituality in relationship to gender, is really interesting. That's the generation that prefigures the post-black movement that's the freestyle is representing. I think that's really fascinating.
There was a hand way in the back.
I've always pronounced his name Dubois. And you say Du Bois.
He's from Massachusetts, not France, and we have a way of making doing funny things with French here.
He pronounced it Du Bois. It's true, but we also go by the way that people pronounced it. He was very specific about two things. Number one, that Negro is always capitalized in his works. It is never uncapitalized, and that his name is Du Bois. And that for him was a high reminder that he chose at a time when most middle-class African Americans were looking to France. He's looking to Germany and the African continent. And so for him, that name has a lot of power, and he always said it was Du Bois.
So, and the other question that I wanted to ask you, you're from UMass, right? Do you study or talk about or whatever Black authors, Black literature?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, pretty often. It's what the Commonwealth pays me for.
Okay. Are you familiar with Frank Yerby?
Yes.
Oh, you are?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, that's good to know. Because I have spoken to everyone all over the United States and everywhere, and I speak to different people, blacks. And I casually do this on purpose.
I even read his stuff when I was a kid. I had no idea he was black.
Nobody knows him. Blacks don't know him.
Oh, yeah.
How many people here know a black Frank Yerby? Well, that's big. Because I think the bigger audiences and zero. Have you ever thought about doing something about him, honoring him somehow? I mean, he was the most famous author.
Well, you know who's doing something has done something with Frank Yerby is a guy named Gene Jarrett, who's the head of African American Studies at Boston University, and he's been writing about Frank Yerby. Also, some of the people who've been writing about what's the Black Chicago Renaissance, which is where Frank Yerby started out, have also talked about Yerby's early stuff. I think you're probably right, though, in terms of his, I guess you'd say, his popular fiction, his romances, and his westerns and so forth. Probably not so much.
Well, if you notice that the books he wrote, in it, he always talked about slavery. So there were romantic novels where he put slavery and all the facts and so on and so forth. So he melded history into his romance novels, which was exciting. They were made into movies. They made full movies. He is great. And I can't understand why black community do not know him and not proud of him.
I think there's it's interesting, right? Because we're still at a point where Du Bois would say that we still don't have a contingent of black teachers teaching black youth. And so the idea of canon and black artists who are allowed to speak to those of us who are very fortunate to be in the academy, and then we're given license to raid the museum, right? To raid the library for something new to say. But he's not in the canon, which is a very interesting thing, which I take your point, that definitely needs to be corrected. But I'm, in some ways, a bit hopeful, because think about Nella Larson's passing, which was not in the canon up until about 10 years ago, and now you can't get away from it, right? So I think the more we fight, the more Frank Yerby, and his book, Judas, My Brother, was the one who made me go to divinity school. It is beautiful.
Really? Yeah.
It is beautiful.
And it's something that the black community can be proud about. Do you know that I wrote a letter to Obama, which I'm upset with him, to ask him to honor him on History Month, Black History Month? Nothing. I didn't get anything from that.
And he's a Chicago guy, too.
I used to write to Bush, and Bush would personally write back to me. I wrote to DeVal Patrick, which I worked with, and he never responded, did absolutely nothing.
Another Chicago guy. What's going on? But you know, we can't talk too much longer, but I will give a little pitch for African American Studies, Africana Studies, Black Studies, which is to say that this is a field which is a dynamic field in a lot of ways. A lot of good stuff is going on. But the other thing that's exciting, if people want to get into it, say like literary, cultural studies, art studies, and history for that matter, is that there's tons, there remains still tons of really important work, good work, despite all the work that's happened in the last 40 years to be done, that you can get in this and really feel like, oh gee, I'm making a real contribution to things, as opposed to writing like the 6,000th PhD on Milton or something like that. You really can get into this line of work and really feel like, wow, I'm doing something that nobody has ever done. Maybe the thing I'm doing is going to be the best thing on this that's ever been written, ever been done. So it's. I mean, people. I don't know. Back me up here. It's exciting.
It is.
But
it can be overwhelming.
So
sometimes.
somebody could write their dissertation. If there's someone isn't doing it now, someone could write a dissertation on Frank Yerby, which could become a book. Yeah. Go for it.
And to research the murals in this
Yeah.
Oh, that too.
Yes. What a wonderful research topic for graduate students.
Well, you got it, and you really should do it now because the people who did them won't be with us forever.
For much longer.
But you could still, a lot of them I'm sure are still around. You still could talk to them.
So I want to thank everyone, the PAHMUSA and
Thank you all for coming.
Hood and PAHMUSA for hosting this.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.